Alright, welcome back to Snappy Software, the ACM video series where we're talking about basic software engineering skills that seem more difficult than they actually are. This is episode 2, How to Connect to Your Database, where we'll be talking about how you can actually interface with the database that we created during part 1. Now, if you watched part 1, you should be about here. You're on your dashboard for Amazon RDS, and you have this new database that you just created. I called mine test. You might have called yours something different. But if you click on test, it'll bring you into the main menu for it, where it has a whole bunch of information about different things that you might need in order to connect to it. And that's where something like a database manager is going to come in. So there's lots of different ways to connect to a database, and depending on what you're using it for, you might use different interfacing tools. But today, I'm going to show you what is probably the simplest option, and that is editing and viewing your database with a database manager. Now, a database manager is a tool that you use to make edits and view and connect to a database. My favorite database manager is dbeaver Community, but I've also heard good things about HeidiSQL. But personally, this is the one that I like to use, and this is the one that we're going to use during this video. So choose whichever one you want, but if you want to be able to follow directly along with this video, go ahead and choose dbeaver. They're really easy to download and install. Just get a version of it downloaded, and maybe pause the video here and then come back when you're ready. But for right now, we're going to go back into the console, and there's actually a couple steps that we need to do before we can connect to our database. So first I'm going to explain a little bit about where your database is and why these steps are necessary. So your database is being hosted remotely by Amazon in one of their server farms. So they have a building where they have tons and tons of server racks, and on one of them, in a physical machine somewhere probably in the United States, there is a small bit of a computer that's being allocated to running your database. So it's real hardware that your database is running on. So by default, it won't let you connect to that database from outside of their server farm, and it also restricts who is allowed to connect to it. So what we need to do is we need to define who's allowed to talk to our database, who's allowed to gain information from it, view it, connect to it. And the way you do that is you create a security group. So by default, you have the default security group, but as I just mentioned, you can't just connect to that from anywhere if you're using this default one. So we're actually going to go ahead and create our own security group. So just go ahead and click on default, and that will bring you to the security group menu, where we're going to click create security group up in the upper right hand corner. So click that, and you'll be brought to this page. Now you need to put in a name and description for your security group. I'm just going to call mine my security and a basic security group. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create a security group that allows anyone, anywhere to connect to this database, as long as they know the host name, the port, the name of the database, and the username and password. If you're creating a database that's going to store some really important information, you might want to be a little bit more savvy about deciding who's allowed to connect to your database or not. But for right now, for academic purposes and things that are of low concern of security, we're just going to create a security group that allows anybody anywhere to connect to it. So down here you have your inbound rules and your outbound rules. Now outbound rules are who is the database allowed to talk to. By default, that's everybody. And inbound rules are who's allowed to talk to the database. And this is where we need to make a change. So we're going to hit this add a rule, and under type, we're going to say we want it to be accessible to all traffic. And under source, we're going to say all traffic coming from anywhere. And this is going to define a range of addresses that are allowed to connect. And this range is all addresses. You don't have to put in a description. You can if you want, but I'm just going to leave that blank for now. So once you've added that, we can leave outbound rules alone because that's already allowing your database to talk to anyone. And you can just hit create security group. So now you have your new security group, but just making this security group isn't enough. We have to tell our database that we want it to use this security group. So you're going to go back to your console here and scroll up to the upper right hand corner and hit this modify button. So you're going to hit modify, and it's going to, spin up the connections. This might take a couple minutes, or maybe not a couple minutes, but a few seconds, because you are connecting to actual hardware somewhere. And once you're in this menu, we're going to go ahead and let our database know that we want it to use our new security group. So scroll all the way down to connectivity, and you'll see that under security group, the only one selected is default, but we don't want the default security group anymore. So just go ahead and click the X on that to delete it, and go in here and select your new security group. I have a couple other security groups. I use these databases quite frequently, so that's why mine might look different from yours, but yours should probably just have default and my security, or whatever you named your security group that we just created. Now, great, so now our database will allow any address to connect to it. However, we need to let Amazon know that we're expecting that traffic will come from outside of their server center. So currently, if we just left it like this, then it would accept all addresses, but only all addresses that are local to the hardware that your server is running on. So we need to let them know that we want to be able to connect from anywhere. So the way you do that is you go into additional connectivity configuration, and you click publicly accessible. You check that box, and now if you allow it to be publicly accessible, then all addresses from anywhere in the world are allowed to connect to it. But of course, they still need to know the username and password and all the other connectivity parameters. So once you've done that, you can scroll all the way down to the bottom and hit continue. Then you'll be on this page, and you'll see a summary of the different things that you're telling it to do, and then when you want it to do that. Just go ahead and hit immediately. If you hit schedule during the next maintenance window, it's going to wait some time, maybe a few hours, maybe a few minutes, it depends on when it's going to update and make that change, but we want this to happen immediately. We don't have all day. So go ahead and hit modify DB instance, and it will bring you back to this page. This is your dashboard for your databases. And if you click here, you'll see that under security, it is adding your My Security group, and it's removing the default, and it hasn't updated yet to be publicly accessible. So a little quirk with this is it doesn't update this available under info until you refresh the page. So if you go and refresh the page, you'll find that this info changes to the word modifying, and as long as it's modifying, you can't connect to the database. So I'm going to catch you back in a couple minutes once this is done. Just keep refreshing the page maybe every 5 minutes, and very soon it will be done. And I will be back when it is. Alright, we're back about 5 minutes later, and as you can see under info, we are now back to available with a green check. And under security, we're using My Security group, and our database is publicly accessible. So now it's time to start connecting. this is where the database manager that I talked about earlier is going to come into play. So I'm going to put this stuff on half of my screen because we're going to have to reference back to it later, and I will open dbeaver on the other half of the screen. This is what the basic interface looks like. If you chose HeidiSQL, it might look a little bit different, but on either one, you're going to look for a button that says New Database Connection. So go ahead and click on that, and if you recall back to the first video, you'll remember that we decided to make our database a MySQL database. So go ahead and click on that, and click Next. Now here's where things get a little bit complicated if you don't know what you're doing, but we're going to walk through it step by step, and it'll be super easy and painless. Alright, so the first field is server host. So that is where should dbeaver, HeidiSQL, whatever you're using to connect to your database, look for your database. Now in terms of Amazon RDS, that information is called endpoint. The endpoint is how Amazon exposes your database to the internet. So you're going to go ahead and copy the endpoint off of this page and paste it into your server host field. The next thing is the port. This is the default port for SQL, for MySQL, so you'll find that if you chose the MySQL on the previous page, it should auto-populate with the correct port. As you can see, 3306, 3306. So you don't have to change that at all. The next part, if you recall back to the first video, there was a part when we were creating the database where I was like, this is really important. If you don't go into this additional configuration and put in a name for your database, it'll only reserve the space for your database. It won't actually create it. This is where that comes into play. Whatever name you put into that field while you're creating your database, you need to know that in order to connect to it. So when I made that database back in video 1, I put in test as the name. You might have put something different. It needs to be whatever you put in there. Finally, you need your username and password. This was the first thing that we set up on the database. If you didn't change the username, it should default to admin, and then put in whatever password you set for it. So I put this, and that's it. We're ready to go. So go ahead and hit test connection, and this will take a couple seconds, maybe 5 seconds, to make the connection to the data center that your database is connected to. And once it's ready, and you'll know that everything is correct when it brings up this page and says success, you have connected to your database. So hit OK, and we'll hit finish, and it'll appear in this list. These are a couple other databases that I use, but this is the one that we just created. So if you click the drop down here, it will have to do the connection again. As you saw, it took 4 seconds last time. It'll probably take 4 to 6 seconds this time. And then it will pop up the information about your database. If you drop down databases, you'll find your test database here. And here's all of the information you need to know about your database. You click on tables, you'll see that there are no tables because it is an empty database. But from here, you can go ahead and create tables. You can start adding information into those tables. The sky's really the limit. And no matter what way that you're trying to connect to this database, that's all of the information you're going to need. You just need to know the endpoint, the port, the name of the database, and your username and password. And any system that you use is going to be exactly the same. You're just going to have that information. So yeah, that is pretty much it with how to connect to your database. If you have any questions, be sure to let us know in the comment box below, and we might make another video about it. But otherwise, we'll see you next time with something probably a little bit different. Have a nice day.